The most ruthless crime boss in Chicago could orchestrate a murder with a single whisper, but he was entirely powerless against the agonizing screams of his newborn son. Every touch burned the infant, until a desperate, debt-ridden nurse crossed his heavily guarded threshold and committed a profoundly unthinkable act. Winter in Chicago was unforgiving, but the chill winds whipping off Lake Michigan were nothing compared to the absolute, suffocating cold inside the DeLuca estate. Gilbert DeLuca, the undisputed head of the city's most powerful syndicate, stood in the center of a nursery that cost more than most residential blocks. The room was a sprawling masterpiece of imported Italian marble, hand-carved mahogany, and sheer silk drapery. But to Gilbert, it was a torture chamber. From the center of an ornate crib, a sound pierced the air. A shrill, vibrating, endless scream. It was his 3-month-old son, Luca. 2 months prior, Gilbert's world had been violently fractured. A rival faction had ambushed his armored convoy downtown. Gilbert had survived with a grazed shoulder. His wife, Valerie, the pristine, beloved matriarch of the family, had not. She had died in the back seat, her body draped over baby Luca, shielding him from the barrage of bullets. The baby had emerged physically without a scratch, pulled from the wreckage covered in his mother's blood. Gilbert had sworn vengeance, and he had delivered it, painting the streets red until the rival faction was nothing but ash and memory. But the true casualty of that night wasn't an empire. It was his son. Ever since the ambush, Luca could not be touched. If a maid tried to lift him to bathe him, the infant's back would arch in unnatural rigidity, his tiny fists clenching until his knuckles turned white, and he would release a wail so high-pitched and breathless it sounded like his vocal cords were tearing. If Gilbert tried to hold his air, pressing the boy to his chest to offer comfort, the reaction was catastrophic. The baby would shake violently, sweating and screaming until his face turned a terrifying shade of plum. Gilbert, a man who commanded legions of hardened killers, was reduced to a ghost haunting his own hallways, his hands hovering inches above his suffering child, terrified to make contact. "He is physically sound, Mr. DeLuca, I assure you," Dr. Henry Moreau stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. Moreau was a $5,000 an hour concierge pediatrician, a man used to treating the sniffles of billionaires' children. He was not used to being flanked by 2 men holding suppressed automatic weapons. Physically sound? Gilbert's voice was dangerously low, a deadly rumble that made the doctor flinch. Gilbert stepped away from the crib, his tailored suit hanging off a frame that had lost 15 pounds from pure stress and sleep deprivation. He grabbed Moreau by the lapels of his pristine white coat, lifting the older man onto his toes. "Listen to him. Listen to my son. He sounds like he is being flayed alive. Does that sound physically sound to you?" It's trauma, Gilbert," Moreau choked out, his eyes darting to the guards. "Severe psychosomatic trauma. The noise of the gunfire, the sudden loss of his mother's presence. It's an extreme form of colic, mixed with a sensory processing disorder, triggered by PTSD. His nervous system is overreactive. I can prescribe stronger sedatives." "You've sedated him for 3 weeks!" Gilbert roared, finally snapping, shoving the doctor back against the wall. A framed painting rattled and crashed to the floor. "He doesn't eat. He barely sleeps. When he wakes up, he screams until he vomits. If you give my son another pill that makes him stare at the ceiling like a corpse, I will put a bullet in your kneecap." Moreau practically fled the estate that night, joining the long list of elite specialists, neurologists and master nannies who had quit, been fired, or fled in terror. The collateral damage of the crying was bleeding into the DeLuca empire. Gilbert hadn't sat at the head of the syndicate's table in a month. Shipments were being delayed. turf was being encroached upon. Later that evening, Vincent Costa, Gilbert's fiercely loyal underboss and childhood friend, found Gilbert sitting on the floor of the hallway outside the nursery. He had his hands pressed over his ears, his eyes bloodshot and vacant. The relentless, shrill crying echoed through the heavy oak door. Hardened enforcers patrolling the perimeter were wearing industrial earplugs, driven to the brink of madness by the endless sound of an infant suffering. "Gabe," Vincent said softly, crouching beside him. "The Russians are testing the southern borders. We lost 2 shipments at the docks tonight. The men need you. You're the Don. You can't lead from the floor of a nursery." Gilbert slowly lowered his hands. "If I can't even fix my own blood, Vincent, what kind of Don am I? The boy is broken, and I can't even hold him." "We'll find someone," Vincent promised, his jaw set tightly. "Someone who isn't a terrified society doctor. Someone who actually knows how to pull a kid back from the brink." Nora Hayes was exactly 26, utterly exhausted and absolutely drowning. Working the grueling night shift in the neonatal intensive care unit at St. Jude's, an underfunded, overcrowded public hospital on the grim side of the city, had stripped Nora of any romantic illusions about medicine. She dealt with the babies the world forgot, the premature, the drug-addicted, the abused. She was exceptionally good at her job, but skill didn't pay the bills. Her late father's battle with pancreatic cancer had left her saddled with $150,000 in medical debt. The bank was threatening foreclosure on her childhood home. She had been surviving on vending machine coffee and 4 hours of sleep for a year. So, when a man in a bespoke suit intercepted her in the hospital parking garage at 4 a.m., flanked by an imposing black SUV, Nora didn't scream. She was too tired. "Nora Hayes," the man had said smoothly, "top of your nursing cohort. 3 years specializing in high-trauma neonatal care, currently facing eviction." He opened a briefcase, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills. $100,000, tax-free, for 1 month of exclusive, absolute, unquestioning private care. You ask no questions about the employer. You surrender your phone. You fix the child. Desperation makes its own rules. Nora took the briefcase. 2 hours later, after a blindfolded ride in the back of the SUV, Nora found herself standing in the grand foyer of the DeLuca estate. She was aggressively patted down by a female guard, stripped of her smartwatch, and marched up the sweeping marble staircase by Vincent Costa. "Do not speak to the boss unless spoken to," Vincent instructed grimly as they approached the heavy oak doors of the nursery. "Do not make sudden movements. He is volatile. The kid hasn't stopped screaming for hours." Nora could hear it. Even through the thick wood, the wail was piercing. But as she listened, her clinical instincts flared. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her brow furrowed. That cry. It wasn't the rhythmic, demanding cry of a hungry baby. It wasn't the sudden, sharp shriek of pain from colic or gas. It was a high-pitched, continuous, tremulous wail. A vibrating scream. She had heard that exact pitch 1,000 times in the charity wards of St. Jude's. Vincent pushed the doors open. The nursery was stiflingly hot, the crystal chandeliers blazing with blinding light. Gilbert DeLuca stood near the window, looking less like a mafia kingpin and more like a caged, feral animal. He was holding the baby at arm's length, his face pale with a mixture of terror and suppressed rage. The baby was thrashing violently, dressed in an intricate, stiff designer silk onesie. "Put him down!" Gilbert snapped at a terrified maid cowering in the corner holding a bottle. "The formula makes him vomit." He turned his dark, bloodshot eyes to Nora. The raw danger radiating from him was palpable. "You're the new nurse. If you hurt him, You won't leave this house alive. Fix it." Nora didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her eyes locked entirely on the baby. "Hand him to me." Gilbert hesitated, his grip tightening protectively. "If I hand him over, he screams louder. He hates being touched. It's trauma." "Give me the baby, Mr. DeLuca." Her voice commanded absolute authority, a tone Gilbert was completely unaccustomed to hearing directed at him. Shocked by her audacity, he slowly transferred the thrashing infant into Nora's arms. The moment she took Luca, she felt it. The baby was rigid, his muscles tight as coiled springs. He was sweating profusely through the expensive silk. He yawned massively, then sneezed 3 times in rapid succession, all while continuing that awful, vibrating wail. His little legs were shaking with uncontrollable tremors. Nora looked around the brightly lit, overheated room, then down at the stiff, irritating fabric the baby was wearing. She looked at the terrified Don. She took a deep breath. She was about to do the unimaginable. She was about to sign her own death warrant. "Turn off the lights," Nora ordered. Gilbert blinked. "What?" "Turn off the damn chandeliers. They are overstimulating him. Do it now," Nora barked. Vincent gasped, stepping forward, but Gilbert, stunned by the sheer force of her command, flicked the switch. The room plunged into soothing shadows, lit only by a small amber nightlight. Next, Nora laid the screaming baby on the changing table and began swiftly unbuttoning the $500 silk onesie. "What are you doing?" Gilbert demanded, closing the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "He's cold. Leave his clothes." "These clothes are synthetic and stiff. They feel like sandpaper to a hypersensitive nervous system," Nora said sharply. She stripped the baby down to his diaper. The tremors in Luca's limbs were highly visible now. The baby was shaking uncontrollably. Nora reached into her standard-issue canvas medical bag and pulled out a cheap, perfectly worn, ultra-soft cotton hospital blanket. She turned to Gilbert, looking the most feared man in Chicago dead in the eye. "Dr. Moreau is an overpaid coward," Nora stated, her voice steady but echoing loudly in the quiet tension of the room. "Your son does not have colic. He does not have PTSD. He doesn't hate being touched. He hates being touched incorrectly because his nerve endings are currently on fire." Gilbert's eyes narrowed into lethal slits. "Speak plainly." "Your son is experiencing severe neonatal abstinence syndrome," Nora said, delivering the fatal blow. "He is detoxing. He is in withdrawal." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the crying had been. Vincent's hand instantly went to the holster inside his jacket. Gilbert stood frozen, the color draining completely from his face, before rushing back in a dark, violent flush of pure fury. "What did you just say?" Gilbert's voice was barely a whisper, vibrating with a deadly promise. "Look at the symptoms," Nora pushed on, refusing to back down, pointing at the shivering infant. The high-pitched, tremulous cry, the hyperactive reflexes, the excessive yawning and sneezing, the sweating, the inability to feed because his suck-swallow reflex is uncoordinated. The billionaire doctors you hired were too terrified of who you are to test the baby's meconium or suggest the truth. Gilbert lunged. In a fraction of a second, his hand wrapped around Nora's throat, slamming her backward into the mahogany doorframe. The impact knocked the wind out of her. Vincent drew his gun, aiming it at the floor but ready. "My wife!" Gilbert hissed, his face inches from Nora's, his breath hot, was a saint. She was pure. "Are you calling the mother of my child a junkie?" Nora gagged, clawing at his iron grip, her vision spotting. From the table, Luca's screams reached a fever pitch, sounding almost like a siren of physical agony. "Kill me!" Nora choked out, her voice ragged. Kill me, and you kill your son, because I am the only one who knows how to save him." Gilbert stared into her eyes. He saw no deception. He saw no malice, only the fierce, defiant truth of a nurse trying to protect a patient. Slowly, agonizingly, Gilbert listened to the tremors in his son's cries. He remembered the long hours Valerie had spent locked in her private bathroom. He remembered her lethargy in the mornings, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle snapped together in his mind. He dropped Nora. She crumpled to the floor, gasping violently for air, clutching her bruised neck. Gilbert backed away, his hands trembling. The unbreakable Don looked entirely shattered. "Fix him," he whispered, a tear finally escaping his eye. "Please." Nora didn't waste a second. She scrambled up. She took the soft hospital blanket and began to swaddle Luca. But she didn't do a normal swaddle. She pulled his arms tightly down to his chest, crossing them securely to physically block the tremors, creating a rigid, tight C shape that mimicked the exact pressure of the womb. She scooped the tight bundle up, pressing Luca's head firmly against her own chest. But instead of rocking him side to side, which she knew scrambled the vestibular system of a withdrawing infant, she held him upright and began to do deep, slow, vertical squats. Up and down, up and down. She began to hum a low, continuous, rhythmic bass note. Gilbert and Vincent watched, paralyzed. For the first minute, the baby fought it, shrieking. But Nora's grip was unyielding. She provided the absolute, physical boundary his withdrawing body desperately needed. By the second minute, the shrill wail cracked, breaking into a series of exhausted hiccups. By the third minute, the tremors stopped. And then, for the first time in 60 days, absolute, unbroken silence fell over the De Luca estate. Luca was asleep. The following morning, the storm had finally broken, leaving Spokane cast in a cold, sharp sunlight. High above the damp streets, on the top floor of a glass and steel high-rise, Henry Boyle stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, sipping a freshly pulled espresso. Boyle was a man who wore his wealth like armor. Bespoke Italian suits, a platinum watch, and a perpetual smirk of superiority. He had built an empire by buying distressed properties, evicting the desperate, and flipping the buildings for massive tax write-offs. To him, people like Rebecca and Harper were not human beings. They were simply negative numbers on a spreadsheet. His peaceful morning was shattered by the frantic buzzing of his intercom. "Mr. Boyle," his secretary Brenda whispered. Her voice was trembling so violently it sounded like static. "You need to lock your door. Security is... they're gone. The elevators just opened and..." The heavy oak doors of Boyle's office didn't open. They burst inward, the biometric lock shattering under the force of a size 14 steel-toed boot. Boyle dropped his espresso cup. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark coffee splashing onto his polished wingtips. Jackson Grizzly Miller stepped into the pristine office. He was flanked by 6 of the largest, most battle-scarred members of the Iron Syndicate. Their leather cuts squeaked in the quiet room, smelling of gasoline, wet asphalt, and impending violence. Outside in the hallway, 24 more bikers had formed a silent, impenetrable wall, effectively taking the entire corporate floor hostage without drawing a single weapon. "What is the meaning of this?" Boyle demanded, his voice cracking as he instinctively backed up against his desk. "I know the chief of police. I play golf with the mayor. You thugs are going to federal prison for this." Grizzly didn't blink. He walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug, his heavy boots grinding the spilled porcelain and coffee into the fibers. He stopped inches from Boyle, towering over the billionaire. The air in the room felt dangerously thin. "Call them," Grizzly rumbled, his voice a terrifyingly calm bass line. "Call the chief. Call the mayor. But before you do, you might want to look at what Spider found. A wiry biker with thick-rimmed glasses and a neck completely covered in geometric tattoos stepped forward. This was Spider, the club's intelligence officer and resident hacker. He casually tossed a thick, black, leather-bound folder onto Boyle's desk, right next to a silver-plated pen set. "We don't just ride bikes, Henry," Grizzly said, leaning over the desk. "We run businesses, which means we know how to read the books. Spider here spent the whole night digging through your digital trash." Boyle's face drained of color as he looked down at the open folder. "Page 4, Grizzly instructed. "That's the ledger showing the federal housing grants you embezzled through shell companies in the Caymans. Page 12 shows the safety inspection bribes you paid out for the 4th Street complex, the same complex where black mold gave a dozen kids chronic asthma. Page 20 is my personal favorite. That's the paper trail proving you hired an arsonist to burn down a rival developer's warehouse 3 years ago." Boyle stared at the documents, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The evidence was absolute. It was enough to put him away for 3 consecutive lifetimes. What do you want?" Boyle whispered, his arrogant facade completely dissolved. "Money. Name your price." "I already have $1, Grizzly replied, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "I don't need your dirty money, but you are going to pay a debt." Grizzly pulled a single, crisp legal document from inside his leather jacket and slapped it down over the blackmail material. "This is a transfer of deed," Grizzly explained, "for the 4th Street apartment complex. You are signing it over, in its entirety, to a woman named Rebecca Wright. You are selling it to her for exactly $1. Furthermore, you are going to wire $500,000 from your personal Cayman account into a trust fund for her daughter, Harper. Consider it a late relocation fee." "That building is worth $4 million, Boyle gasped, his greed briefly overriding his terror. Grizzly leaned in, his scarred face inches from Boyle's perfectly manicured nose. "And your freedom is worth nothing. Sign the paper, Henry, or Spider hits send, and the FBI, the IRS, and the local news get an email that ends your life as you know it." Boyle's hands shook uncontrollably as he picked up his silver pen. He signed the document. Rebecca woke up to the sound of soft, steady breathing. She opened her eyes, disoriented by the crisp white sheets, the plush pillows, and the blast of warm air coming from the hotel suite's heating vent. She sat up in a panic, but then she saw Harper. Her daughter was asleep in the adjacent bed, her color returned to normal, the terrifying rattle in her chest completely gone. The private doctor the bikers had paid for had arrived at 2 a.m., administered antibiotics, and assured Rebecca the little girl would be perfectly fine. Before Rebecca could fully process the miracle of the previous night, there was a timid knock at the suite door. She cautiously opened it to find a nervous man in a cheap suit holding a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Wright?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold hallway. "I represent Henry Boyle Properties. I was instructed to deliver this to you immediately." He handed her a thick manila envelope and practically ran down the hallway to the elevators. Rebecca opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000, made out to Harper's newly established medical and education trust. Behind it was a legal deed. Rebecca read the paperwork 3 times, her knees buckling as she slid down the doorframe, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just safe. She owned the 4th Street building. She could turn it into a co-op, freeze the rent for the struggling families still living there, and secure her daughter's future forever. She knew exactly who had done this, and she knew she couldn't accept it without looking the man in the eye. That afternoon, after leaving Harper safely with a trusted friend from her old building, Rebecca drove the Honda Civic back to Hank's Route 9 diner. When she walked in, the diner was quiet. Grizzly was sitting alone in the exact same corner booth Rebecca had occupied weeks ago. A single cup of black coffee sat in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his intimidating features softening just a fraction. "The kid okay?" he asked gruffly, taking a sip of his coffee. "She's fine," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with emotion. She sat across from him and placed the deed and a copy of the check on the table. "Mr. Miller, Grizzly, I don't understand. I know Harper was sweet to you, but this is a fortune. You ruined a billionaire to give us this. Why? Why go to this extreme for a stranger?" Grizzly stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his leather cut and pulled out his heavy chain wallet. He opened it and carefully extracted the heavily creased $1 bill Harper had given him. He laid it flat on the formica table between them. "When I was a younger man, I made a lot of enemies," Grizzly began, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 years ago, a rival crew ambushed me outside a dive bar in Seattle. They stabbed me 4 times and left me to bleed out in a dark alley. I was dying, Rebecca. I could feel the cold creeping into my chest. But a man walking back to his truck heard me coughing. He didn't run. He dragged my heavy, bleeding carcass into the cab of his pickup, ruined his seats, and sped me to the emergency room. He saved my life." Rebecca listened, mesmerized, but confused as to what this had to do with her. "When the doctors stabilized me," Grizzly continued, "the man came to check on me. I asked him his name, told him I'd give him anything he wanted. Protection, money, a favor. He just laughed. He said he didn't help people for a reward. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $1 bill and handed it to me. He told me to buy myself a coffee and pass the kindness on when I was ready." Grizzly pointed a massive, calloused finger at the bottom corner of the $1 bill sitting on the table. "I kept that dollar in my pocket for years as a reminder that there were still good men in the world. But I lost it 3 years ago, in a poker game in Nevada. It broke my heart to lose it, until your little girl handed it back to me." Rebecca leaned forward, looking closely at the dollar. There, stamped in faded, waterproof red ink, right next to George Washington's portrait, was a tiny symbol. It was a perfectly stamped red anchor with the initials TW underneath it. Rebecca gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as a fresh wave of tears blinded her. "Thomas," she choked out. "My husband, Thomas Wright. He used to stamp all his tip money with that anchor. He said he wanted to be a stable force for people. He tracked bills online as a hobby. He was a good man," Grizzly said, his heavy eyes shining with unspoken grief. "And when Harper handed me this dollar, his dollar, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. A man who saves my life doesn't leave his family to freeze in a car. The universe brought this piece of paper back to me so I could finally pay off the debt I owed him." Grizzly slid the $1 bill across the table, pressing it gently into Rebecca's trembling hands. "The debt is paid, Mrs. Wright," the giant biker said softly. "You and Harper are under the protection of the Iron Syndicate now. No one will ever hurt you again." Grizzly stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the table for the coffee, and walked out the door. The bell chimed, the heavy engine roared to life in the parking lot, and as Rebecca sat clutching the stamped dollar to her chest, she finally felt the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. A single, crumpled $1 bill didn't just buy a cup of black coffee, it balanced the brutal scales of fate. Harper's innocent act of kindness echoed through the gritty streets of Spokane, dismantling a corrupt empire and bringing a guardian angel to her door. Sometimes, The absolute smallest gestures carry the weight of true salvation, proving that even in the darkest storms, a tiny spark can ignite a life-saving fire.